I won't attempt to summarize people's bios. I'll simply introduce them by name, but I do encourage you to have a look at the website, which gives you a full description of their very varied and interesting backgrounds. So I will first ask Shi Lin from Fudan University to give the first of our three presentations. Shi Lin.
Okay, thank you, Desmond. It's this is a very lively example of how technology actually dictates nowadays the way we think, and then without technology, or when we experience like technology failure, we're absolutely incapacitated from speaking. So, so we need to think about that. Well, my topic actually is on artificial intelligence, and it's my background is actually in political philosophy. So when I was having a chat with Sakiko this summer, and I was telling her about this project that I have been doing, which is on big data and research ethics, and then Sakiko was asking me that is it possible that you do something like on China, and then to talk about this artificial intelligence, because apparently that there have been a lot of people who are focusing on big data, because big data apparently is a very trendy topic nowadays. And I was thinking about it, especially that there's very issue of AI. And then this is why that my presentation today is going to be a bit shifted from the focus of reproducing inequalities or inequities in health towards like more a description of China and how AI actually has been deployed and implemented in China. So my presentation shall be divided into three parts. The first part I'm going to talk about in a very brief and sketchy manner about what is artificial intelligence, because apparently that, we have been speaking about AI for many times, but then it seems that, well, at least in public perception, sometimes AI and big data has been conflated together, so they are not really clearly demarcated or distinguished from each other. So that is why that I'm going to give a very brief, sketchy outline of what is artificial intelligence. And then on the top of that, I'm going to give an introduction and about what AI actually now is in China. And then finally, we will lead on to a discussion of the ethical issues of inequalities and inequities. So AI, as we understand about it, actually the biggest difference between AI and big data is that AI involves machine learning. So AI, there's artificial intelligence. This intelligence part is not simply feeding data into the machine, but rather, it's enabling the machine to learn on its own outside or, totally autonomous from human control. And this artificial intelligence is enabling machines to make independent and standalone decisions concerning, concerning human affairs. And this artificial intelligence apparently is based very much on feeding data into the machine. So I actually have been reading a report which has been published by USAID recently, and they have provided a quadrichotomy, which is basically four-dimensional model of how AI is actually implemented in public health. And they basically have classified AI to be used in the following four ways. The first one is population research. Population system means AI normally involves predictive analytics, like it's using a large scale and a vast amount of data to feed into the machine so that the machine could actually make some predictions about epidemics, for instance, and then also public health issues over a certain period of time to forecast. And this is one thing. The second thing is individual health. And this individual health normally involves the using of artificial intelligence to help patients to do things like, for instance, if you are, experience matters of immobility, then exoskeleton machines could be used, for instance, to provide assistance to you, to enable you to walk or achieve the purposes of mobility. So this is one thing. And then the third point is physician clinical decision support, which means the artificial intelligence sometimes is used to help the doctors and physicians to make clinical decisions. And this is particularly one thing. And then finally, there was this, the frontline health worker, the FHW, dimension of it, which is basically involving providing like support, involving like robotics and so to help with, in general, the whole system, especially involving the pharmaceutical like technology, and then also research on pharmaceutical like pills and so. And these are the 4 areas where artificial intelligence could be used. Now, the second part of my presentation, we are now going to lead on to the description of China. And actually, China has happened in the past 10 years. And a colleague of mine has been doing a research on that. And his research has shown statistically the number of articles on AI published by Chinese scholars in the past 10 years was #1 in the whole world. And then it was seconded by the States. So this shows like there have been an intensive interest in this topic of AI. But then, behind all this like interest, and so we see a quite visible government hand in orchestrating all this development in artificial intelligence. So this is why that when we take a look at those like state policies formulated on AI, and actually we see quite a lot of state policies that have been formulated in recent years on that. So a health specifically related AI policy was formulated 1 year ago, which was roughly in April. And at the time, there was this AI-related health policy that was formulated by the state. And it involved all the 4 dimensions that I have mentioned. The population health, like for instance, in this policy, certain paragraph and also, directive was specifically talking about how to use those predictive analytics to give a precision, forecast of what the next or serious like epidemics might break out in China, especially, for instance, those the serious ones like bird flu or simply flu in China. And then secondly, there was this like the individual part, the individual health, like the development of software and applications, especially to be accessory to the current existing hospitals and then healthcare system, how to help patients to manage and to keep a track record of their health related issues. And then, for like the clinic, clinic decision support system, the CDS, and then with the frontline health workers and the pharmaceutical research, there have been certain like paragraphs in those policies as well on that. But this is not the whole point, because apparently we all know that policy can be one thing, but then its implementation can be another. So what actually has happened in China in the past, especially 3 years, there have been a lot of venture capital that have been encouraged by the state into investing those startup companies to have research and then also develop technologies on AI, health-related AIs and so. So let me give you some examples. The first one is especially this application that has been developed by a company which involving this annual physical checkup. Because in, China actually has this communist legacy, which is involving in the working unit, and where this working unit is quite keen to provide a very basic package of healthcare to its, to the members to the staff members that are working there. So this is okay, and this is thank you, and this is a this application basically is just allowing like this company to gather data and then to help like clients to be able to manage like the changes and transformations of those data and the figures related to their bodily health. And then the second one is especially the use of robotics for the cases of autism. For children of autism, actually, in northeastern part of China, there have been some robotics that were developed to be the emotional companion to these children, and in the hope that, they could actually provide some relief to some of the symptoms of autism. And there have been other like AI technologies as well. But I'm going to use the last few minutes of my presentation to talk about this ethical issue. So traditionally, when we think about AI and those like health inequities in it, and as we can see in previous presentations by Mickey, like there will be this issue of data privacy, and then also the inequality, like unequal access to these resources, and apparently there will also be this very issue of the geographical divide and digital divide as well in that. But on the top of all that, I want to raise like specifically the issues about this north-south divide and then also competition in this. Because I mean, China is regarded as one of the leading countries of the global south. It's actually in quite a fierce competition with countries like the States in taking the lead of AI research and so. So this is why that, I mean, sometimes the speed may be achieved at the expense or sacrifice of those ethical considerations. And actually 2 years ago, the child of the genetically modified child, which was surprising to the whole world, that was a very telling example of when, I mean, this lack of like ethical approval and ethical review of research conducts could actually lead to those like bizarre results. And I have been thinking, I actually have a very nightmare vision about the future world where there's like there's genetically modified children. Because there was one big issue in China at the moment, which is the LGBTQ. And I mean, recently, especially in this May, there had been an article that was published in Science talking about whether gay gene really exists or not. But then although like the researchers in that article, I mean, upon the study of those like 500,000 citizens in the UK, and they were suggesting that there were actually no such like genes, or at best we could only speculate that such genes would play a role when they are contextualized in socially embedded environs. But nevertheless, I mean, a nightmare vision is that if scientists in China can say to the parents, saying that I can help you to cure this gay problem of your children, then, I mean, we can imagine that Chinese parents might flock to these places to have their children, I mean, genetically modified, to become like un-gay or un-lesbian. So, I mean, this is particularly something that, I mean, we would need to think about, I mean, those like ethical issues, and especially that when we contextualize it in this north-south competition, there was this technology impetuity, which means it's actually the state are competing against each other to take the lead in order to occupy this commanding height of technology. But then, I mean, in this process, certain ethical considerations will be sacrificed. So that will be the prominent issue facing all of us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also congratulations on coping with technological breakdown. Do we still have technological breakdown? Yes, we do. So the challenge is now to our second speaker, Elizabeth Gibbons. Thank you. If you could. Quite a challenge. Elizabeth Gibbons from the Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights.
Well,
I apologize on behalf of the organizers, and we have full understanding for your situation.
Well, yes, I mean, it's already nerve-wracking enough, but now I'm without the props, and you've given me such an incredible example of how to cope. But so now I'll do my best to move swiftly along, since you won't be able to feast on my slides. First of all, thank you, Sakiko, for inviting me to this conference. I think it's going to be very exciting, and we're going to learn a lot, especially about addressing the power imbalance to those of us who are hapless users and subjects of this technology, and those who design and own it. And we're looking particularly at how AI can benefit humanity, in this case, the right to health. I'm presenting some of the major aspects of ethically aligned design, the development of which I participated, but I will be speaking in my personal capacity. And this is a document that was essentially crowdsourced by the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineering, IEEE, which is a global engineering standards company. And it led to this effort, which was with many committees, and we have a member of another committee with us. And so they designed a whole platform where ethical issues could be constructed and recommendations on practice of how to implement them proposed. So I am, though, even though I participated in that as a chair of one of the committees, I'm speaking in my personal capacity. It was issued, this publication, Ethically Aligned Design, in this March. It's specifically called First Edition because there's an expectation that with the moving of technology, it's going to be constantly updated with new issues. It was guided by the rigor and standards of the engineering profession, but it was participated with experts, 500 experts from all sorts of disciplines, law and sustainable development and, of course, robotics engineers and philosophers. I mean, the head of the Cambridge Department of Philosophy was one of the participants. So, which shows the incredible diversity of voices that were here, and that also actually is an evidence that we need to create this future. You need to have all these perspectives. I was the chair of the Sustainable Development chapter, and I'll be talking a little bit further about that. It is a technical organization, IEEE, and their members are designing AI applications, but the intention of both from the writers and for the audience of this publication is to be not just for engineers, but for business people, for academics, for philosophers, for those of us concerned about human rights and inequity. It is structured from pillars to practice, and it starts with the universal values. The foundation of this is universal human values and as expressed through human rights, political self-determination and human agency, and technical dependability. And we have 8 cross-cutting principles to guide AI development across diverse fields, each of which is represented in a different chapter, and there are chapters on effective computing, on sustainable development, on well-being, on numerous other ones, which I cannot read in the smallness of my print. The principles are designed to be applied to any AI application in any field. And the very first principle is on human rights, that AI shall be created and or operated to respect, promote, and protect internationally recognized human rights. And this is quite, I think, interesting from that particular community, that this should be such a priority. The other general principles are well-being, data agency, effectiveness, competence, awareness of misuse, and accountability. And a bit later in the presentation, I'm going to use those principles for analyzing how an application in AI can realize the right to health as seen through services that are available, accessible, acceptable, and of high quality. There was a table, quite a colorful table, which showed the extent to which each of the different thematic chapters integrated the principles. And the one principle of those 8 that I just mentioned that is integrated across all the chapters is human rights. And human rights was called for to be as understood as holistic, independent, and interdependent, and not as often we get the impression, it's been mentioned also earlier today, that it's about the right to privacy and the non-discrimination, which is an inevitable effect of the data. The governance frameworks should be new and existing to strengthen that AI not only does not violate human rights, but actually advances human rights, for human dignity and primacy to also be preserved. And this means that AI should not be granted any rights equivalent to human rights, which is actually a discussion that's going on right now in certain academic quarters, but it's very much the position here that humans need to preserve human dignity, human needs to be in the loop and constantly in control of these technologies. There was also a principle which I think is interesting in the context, especially of this conference, that well-being is a principal outcome of ethical AI, considering that human rights protection and fulfillment is the floor and not the ceiling for the standards which AI creators must adhere. Which I was thinking of Philip's example of the woman who got her right to housing recognized. I mean, and yet she was sent to a completely new community where her well-being, whether in terms of community, her culture, her access to jobs, was completely destroyed. So this is saying that, you know, in human rights, yes, absolutely, but the right to work in a context where you're actually working next to a robot, you may not be experiencing well-being. So that's so that this calls for the development of well-being indicators that would actually be used to assess whether this particular application is benefiting humanity or not. There is also a very interesting chapter on classical ethics in this book, which I can't possibly do justice to. Essentially, though, it's saying that, you know, there's way too much emphasis on the philosophy and ethics of Western traditions, and Western traditions are very individualistic in that, therefore, risk a discriminatory impact on non-Western applications, first of all, and that there are many different cultural perspectives and different philosophical traditions which define different ethics, and therefore, as Philip was also saying, really ethics is not the right framework for assessing these technologies. It much more should be about the basic human rights, which are already agreed and in law, and then international law and treaties, of course. So the overall, the IEEE is establishing a standard of ethically aligned design, which is human-centric, with human agency, human rights, and human values, and humans in the loop. As the chair of the Sustainable Development Committee, I led a multidisciplinary team of researchers, robotics engineers. There was even a business dean, a number of private sector people. And we constructed a vision of the future which none of us could have individually imagined. And we revisited the pillar, oh my God. So basically we said, you know, if the purpose of AI is to benefit humanity, then really how do you define benefit to humanity? And we came up with the proxy of being the Sustainable Development Agenda, because of the participatory process that led to it, and because it had been ratified by 193 countries. And that was our proxy. And we recognize that AI has the potential to advance the transformative agenda of the SDGs, leaving no one behind, but also to undermine it by drastically increasing inequality and facilitating human rights abuses. So there's several chapters in our sections in the Sustainable Development chapter, which had the screen been here, you would have been able to admire, but I will just quickly deal with the chapter on equal availability and the focus on leaving no one behind. So it has, as most of you know, the SDGs, a driving principle, leave no one behind. And there are numerous factors, though, mitigating against equal availability for low and middle income countries to AI's potential benefit. And Mickey also came up with several of them. One, of course, is the concentration of AI creator capacity in a few countries, companies, and citizens. There's, in many countries, an inadequate or non-existent IT infrastructure or human capital that's needed to support AI. There's a lack of access in some countries for up to 99% of the population to internet. Therefore, the benefit of AI is not going to reach them, nor are they going to be having their data to help with the machine learning of these different applications. There's a whole data desert in many of the low and middle income countries. There's reluctance on the part of developers to provide open source licensing, unavailability of public data sets, leading to very little possibility for research and development within some of the low and middle income countries. And there's poor adaptability and, of course, totally lack of participation of the populations expected to benefit from these. And I think that's a big issue that we should discuss overall. It came up just in the previous session, is how do you actually have proper participation, the principle of human rights in the deployment of these highly complex technologies that even the developers themselves don't always understand, because you can't trace the decision to what actually the machine has done through its own learning, which is one of the more scary bits. So there's a lot of things to push against to ensure equal availability. We came up with then, of course, some recommendations about closing the gap, both on content and process size, and the content is more of experimenting and bringing to scale of the kinds of applications that Mickey presented earlier today. Strategies for public provision of internet to all societies to develop to diminish the gap between the benefit to the high income and low income countries, and support to civil society for advocating for the marginalized populations. We also had some process recommendations. I will just dash to the last bit, which I see now I've left my paper since my time is running up. Which is how feasible it could be to take some of these principles established in this publication and apply it to the right to health. And the right to health as a framework of the availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality of health, which is something that was defined by the the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in General Comment 14. So how these principles can help guide some of the questions that would be needed about whether this is an application that's going to advance the right to health or not. How available is this application for realizing the right to health? Is it designed to go to scale so that it can become equally available in high income and low and middle income countries? Are there accountability mechanisms assuring that available AI facilitated services and are at the sufficient level? And accessibility. How accessible is this application? Does it discriminate against particular populations? Can it be of benefit in high and middle income countries alike? What actually is the health benefit to whom? If it's not physically accessible, are there particular populations who will not be able to benefit? Whose data was used for training it? How representative is the training data? How accessible is the population in need? And how secure is the data? So the principles of human rights, accountability, well-being, and data agency that were established in this publication can really orient some of these questions and then help go look at, okay, is the right to health being advanced in a fairly systematic way? So I have a short, like 4-page table that goes into that more in detail. So I'll just stop by saying I think that I got an enormous benefit from working on this committee, and particularly when I was first approached to chair this committee, I thought, what do I know about artificial intelligence? My background is in child rights. But the interesting part of doing it is that none of us knew the future. And so we collectively created a vision of the future which would have been totally impossible if it had been just left to robotics engineers or philosophers or anyone. And so we all had a different perspective, and it was a very rich experience. And I think as we're talking about the participation for managing these technologies, we have to have that kind of multidisciplinary, multi-perspective approach, because otherwise we're going to leave out very, very important things. And the great thing also about this, I will say, is IEEE is its audience, even though it's benefiting everybody with this publication, its audience is really engineers. So they are now being given a completely different menu of how to think about what they're doing. And it goes to human rights beyond just ethics. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I'd like to invite our third speaker, Kadija Ferryman from the NYU Tandon School of Engineering, and the title is Ethics and Policy in Precision Medicine. So, Kadija. And again, apologies.
Thank you. So, hi everyone. As I was sitting there in the back, sort of taking in the technological failures and what was going on, I was like, all right, I think I'm going to try to change things up a little bit. I'm going to try to sort of work with what is available to us. And so earlier someone mentioned sort of anthropologists not often being in these kinds of conversations. I am a cultural anthropologist, and one of the strengths of anthropology, so earlier we talked about the, what can be seen as a complicating role of anthropologists is that anthropological data and anthropologists tend to add complexities to the situation, which can sometimes be problematic. But in terms of technology, one of the things that anthropologists, I think, bring as a strength is our disciplinary kind of tradition when we give talks, is that we usually, if we use slides, they're very kind of marginal to what we're talking about, and we often like read right from read a paper. And for this group today, because this is an interdisciplinary group, I actually went off my usual disciplinary kind of tradition and had slides, and I was going to talk from the slides. But like a good anthropologist, I also have a written paper. So for the FYI for the live stream, I'm actually not going to be talking from the slides that I have loaded up there today, and I'm going to talk from a paper that I have that I think really fits well and will be more engaging than me trying to sort of go through the slides. So here we go. Let's see if this works. So thank you all for having me here. My name is Kadija Ferryman, and I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I study the moral and ethical dilemmas that arise when new forms of health data are used in biomedical research, especially research on health disparities. I'm industry assistant professor of ethics and engineering at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering, and was formerly a postdoctoral scholar at the Data and Society Research Institute, an organization here in New York that is focused on critically examining the social and cultural issues that arise from data-centric technological development. So one of the things that Data and Society works on that I believe in as well is that understanding the role of data in our world today is key. And I'm going to be talking about data, which I think fits nicely with the earlier talk sort of distinguishing between AI and data. So let's talk about data. All of us here today are familiar with the word data, and we generally think of data as a repository of information. As an anthropologist, when I think of data, I often think of data as ethnographic data, usually written down in the field. These data are observations that make up the repository that will be analyzed when away from the fieldwork scene and will be used to detect patterns. For those in the life sciences, data often looks like biospecimens, blood and tissue, and these are often in a different format from anthropological data, but still hold information that can be used and analyzed. But increasingly, when we think about data, no matter what field we are in, we increasingly think of digital data. And of course, all other kinds of data can be translated into digital form. And when this digital data is multiplied, we get big data. But all these kinds of data, no matter their form or size, are information things. Data can be gathered and kept in a reservoir. As the Latin root tells us, data means the thing that is given. And we use data as a given, in other words, the thing that we use to create knowledge about the world. But I would like to propose that we rethink our understanding of data. If we interpret the ancient Latin root of data differently, data is not just the thing that is given, but instead a gift. A thing that is given is quite literally a gift. Data then means gift. I want to propose that if we think of data this way, as a gift, we can understand the social dynamics at play today. We can understand the social dynamics at play in today's data projects. So I will use the French sociologist Marcel Mauss to help us think through this idea of data as a gift. In the early 20th century, Mauss studied multiple indigenous cultures around the world and found a pattern in gift giving. He found that giving gifts is actually an activity that has three parts. One receives a gift, one gives a gift, another receives the gift, and receiving a gift triggers an obligation to reciprocate that gift. Whenever you receive a gift, you are obligated to give back in some way. In other words, there's no such thing as a free gift. The gift cycle binds us together, builds social relationships, and keeps society together. We are all connected through giving, accepting, and reciprocating gifts. This theory of the gift also explains the origins of society. We didn't come together in order to conduct transactions, but instead to give gifts. But Moses' theory of the gift does not just explain social harmony, it also provides a way of thinking about social discord. For example, lavish gift giving can be a display of power, and it can also reinforce social inequalities if the receiver is not able to reciprocate at the same level of the gift that was given. Gift giving can be the source of conflict and can create unfulfilled obligations. So the takeaways from the theory of the gift are that 1, gifts are not just things, but are things that create relationships. 2, that gift giving has 3 parts: giving, receiving, and reciprocating. And 3, that gift giving can build social ties as well as reveal social tensions and inequalities. So what happens when we think about data as a gift? Well, first, we move away from thinking about data in the usual way, as a thing, as a repository of information, and begin to think of it in terms of an action. Second, we see that there is an obligation to give back or reciprocate when data is given. And third, we can imagine that giving a lot of data has the potential to create tension. Why think of data as a gift that is connection to actions of giving, reciprocating, and receiving, rather than just think of data as a thing? Well, when we think about data as a thing, it shapes the way we conceive of data problems and what to do when those problems emerge. You can see these social dynamics at play in real data collection projects. Consider the Human Genome Diversity Project. Scientists wanted to collect data from indigenous communities in order to assemble a full map of human genetic diversity, a laudable scientific aim. But some communities criticized this proposal. They felt that there was not enough involvement upstream during the development of the research plan and bristled at what they saw as an extraction of their biological resources. The scientists saw this data as information about the world that could be collected, so they thought of the data as a thing. But if we instead use the framework of the gift, we can think about this controversy in a different way. The genetic data was a gift that could be given and received, but also had to include a reciprocation. The Human Genome Diversity Project was called by some indigenous communities a quote-unquote vampire project, not because it was just taking their blood, but because this name signaled that they felt that their data gift would not be reciprocated. Members of indigenous communities wanted investment in their communities, but outside of the logic of the gift, this kind of giving back to communities and research doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem to be the responsibility of the scientific community. This is not data donation, but instead data gifting that includes giving back. Another example of how the theory of the gift can change our thinking on data problems is the case of the misuse of genetic material from the Havasupai people. The Havasupai accused university researchers of using blood that was given in order to research genetic connections to diabetes for other unapproved research, such as investigating patterns of mating and genetic variability. The tribe won their case against the university, and this is often cited as an example of how consent can go wrong. If we frame this issue in terms of consent, then the issue is how broad does consent need to be? Changes such as shifting the common rule in biomedical research to broaden the scope of consent can then be seen as a solution to this problem. But if we instead use the logic of the gift, then broader consent is not the only solution. We can think about the Havasupai data as a gift that was given and accepted but not reciprocated. The researchers were supposed to give back, namely in the form of research on diabetes. So although work was done that surely improved our understanding of genetic variation and advanced scientific research in this field, this was still not reciprocation. This work may have done good, but it did not give back within the gift relationship. This is why I believe that expanding the scope of consent will not solve all of our data problems. If the obligation to reciprocate is not met, there will still be friction. But we can learn from the past. In my own work, I move away from the data as a repository idea and think about data in a more active sense. I'm examining how data moves in the emerging field of data-driven individualized medicine, also known as precision medicine. In this study, we're tracking how biomedical data travels and how it might be biased or lead to bias despite the best intentions of researchers, clinicians, and data analysts. We know that precision medicine won't work for everyone if the data that powers it doesn't represent everyone. With biased data, precision medicine runs the risk of worsening health disparities rather than improving them. But what would data collection for precision medicine look like if it operated through the logic of the gift? Instead of thinking of how to collect diverse data, we could think about how to form relationships. If we took giving, receiving, and reciprocating as real obligations that are part of the process of collecting health data, we can talk with individuals and communities about what reciprocation means to them, as well as which forms of giving back are the most important. We would see building databases for precision medicine as a project of building cyclical relationships, of offering, accepting, and giving back. The quote-unquote gift givers would become stakeholders, and reciprocation would become part of the process of engagement and building trust in scientific and health research. Thinking about how data is embeddative and constitutive of social relationships can move us closer to data-centric research that will lead to real improvements in health. Thinking of data as a gift can also help us think critically about open data sharing. How might providing data fully and openly be a kind of lavish gift that is a show of power? How does the call for open data reveal who has the power to give in such a way? For example, is it powerful institutions or individuals who are most able to gift their data and make it free and public? And although providing data will do good, what are the other unintended effects of this kind of sharing? Through the logic of the gift, we can see that open data can trigger obligations for others to reciprocate in ways that they may not be able to. For example, we can think about large companies or universities who have the resources to enable data sharing, but smaller ones who might have to divert a significant portion of their resources to this effort. If they express resistance or do not share, they are branded as data hoarders. But instead of vilifying those who cannot share in the same way, we can use the logic of the gift to think carefully about the demands that open data creates. At the conclusion of his book, Mose asks us to think about gifts not just as things, but as things embedded in relationships that help us get to more good faith, more sensitivity, and more generosity. The theory of the gift is powerful because it illuminates something that we all know and feel viscerally. Offering, accepting, and giving back are key parts of sociality. The challenge is how we can think about data not so much as a thing, but as a product and driver of social relationships. Even as we move to more and more digitized data, let's keep the focus on the exchanges that make data possible and the relationships that can be broken or built with our data gifts. Thank you.
So I'll ask Kadija and the other two speakers, I'll ask you to come up and join me. Well, thank you very much indeed for three very interesting and wide-ranging, I think it's fair to say. I was very pleased that this session is about ethics, but not just about ethics, but ethics, ideology, and... I have a discussant. Who will perhaps say some of the same things. Thank you. I will now introduce the discussant, Peter Asaro from the New School. Peter.
Thank you. Human systems sometimes also fail. So I think these were three really very interesting discussions. A lot to kind of wrap my head around and summarize quickly. But I think asking this question about what is AI is a very good place to start. I think there's a lot of hype around AI. It becomes a very magical sort of thing. A lot of people think it's this sort of disembodied intelligence that's far beyond human intelligence, and thus it's going to magically find solutions to all of these problems. Having worked in AI for many years, I can say, no, it is not. It's very difficult to get it to do anything reliably and efficiently. It's getting much better because we have big data, because we have giant server farms, because we can shove lots of data through these neural networks and a technique called machine learning. that we've seen some pretty dramatic improvements in things like natural language processing and the fact that you can talk to Siri or Alexa and it actually can register what you're saying and do something interesting and meaningful in response to that. It doesn't necessarily understand language in anything like the way that we understand language. And so I think when we start thinking about AI hype, we should really substitute a different word there, like math. Is math going to save all of our health inequality problems and fix them? Well, it could if we use it in the right way. But again, it's just math. And it, of course, relies on data. And often we can probably just substitute a word like technology or automation or some other sort of overarching term anywhere that you kind of see, you know, AI instead, just say technology. And I think there is this growing concern around the convergence of a number of these information technologies. The fact that so much data is being collected about us, that data is being used by all sorts of entities and agents and actors that we have no knowledge or control over, that are then automating decision processes based on that data that have real world impacts on us every day. And that, I think, is what people are scared about on the AI side of things. But on the sales side of things, the pitching of it, it's all about optimization. And I think that's the way to also think about what this is a hyper-optimization. But optimization of what? And that's really, I think, where the ethics comes in. And I'll talk tomorrow about governance. So ethics does not equal governance, but it's a good first step. Because unless we know what values we want to optimize, we aren't going to know what system we want to build. And that's really, I think, the key to these debates around ethics, and it's great that the IEEE, I was part of that initiative on the Autonomous Weapons Committee for ethically aligned design. And even in the framing of its name, you have alignment, right? Ethically aligned design. And this is a big concern within artificial intelligence, this issue of value alignment. Because if you take a machine learning system or reinforcement learning system and you optimize it, what are you optimizing to? And there's this sort of mythical fear of the paperclip maximizer that you might have heard about. So we create some super intelligence, we ask it to maximize the efficiency of our paperclip factory, and it turns the entire world into paperclips, right? Because it's so efficient, it's so optimal at what it's been asked to do, it just keeps doing it to the detriment of every other value that you care about. And this, of course, is a sort of fanciful example, but I think it's a real example of the concern we should have with every AI system that we put in place, because what values it's optimizing are going to count against or affect other values that we also care about. And we have to think very long and hard about how we want to frame those values and how do we then want to design systems to optimize those. And these questions of for whom, I think, are very prudent at that point. And I love the idea of the gift giving as a model of the kind of social relation around data. I just published a paper over the summer on predictive policing where I call for an ethics of care for AI ethics, which I think is, again, thinking not in terms of AI ethics as we have some set of principles or values that we are going to implement in these systems. I think those are valuable principles like transparency, accountability, fairness. Of course, the devil is always in the details. How do you actualize those and make them operational in a real system? But if we think in terms of relations between people, between institutions and organizations, and specifically relations of care, which actually comes out of the healthcare and education models of ethics, the ethics of care. And think about that when we're building systems, instead of simply optimizing utilitarian values, think about how do we optimize care for communities and individuals who are going to be affected by the systems that we implement. We'll be a lot better off. So with that, I will turn back over to the panel.
Right. Would you like? Yes, you can join us. Thank you very much. Okay, now I can open up for questions, either on that or the other microphone. Please.
So I thought this was a really fascinating panel. Thank you to everybody. I'm sorry the technology failed, but it really did not hinder how great the panel was. So I have two questions. One, mostly to Liz, but perhaps to others as well, about human rights. We've heard from Philip and then from you also that it's a shame that the conversations are about ethics and not about human rights. And maybe to be a little bit contrarian about that, human rights is also saturated with Western values. And the framework that you mentioned on the right to health, Liz, the availability, accessibility, acceptability, et cetera, viewing those qualities in this context can actually lead us down problematic paths, I would say, when it's all about access to technologies or availability. You can say, for example, in the reproductive health space, access for infertile couples to all kinds of biotechnological treatments, from IVF to so-called three-parent IVF to gene editing technologies, et cetera, and that pushes a narrative that we might not necessarily want to push. So that's one thing. I'm not sure how far using human rights as opposed to ethics and moral and political philosophy gets us. On the other hand, I really did like the conversation about gifts and relationships, and I do think of rights as bundles of relationships, of entitlement and obligation. And I think that's where both big data and the algorithms that are used, as well as machine-based learning, blur those relationships. And one of the things that I think is most problematic that I haven't heard a lot about, and I have a question to the whole panel about, is the threat to democratic governance, the de-democratization, the lack of justification that is presented by artificial intelligence and big data and the algorithms to make policies. So those are my two questions.
I think you were next.
Thanks. Nora Kenworthy. Thanks for a wonderful panel. As we're thinking about the sort of health impacts of these technologies, I'm wondering if we're thinking broadly enough when it comes to the ethics. So, for example, big data has a very concrete carbon footprint. I think there was a recent report from the AI Now Institute that said that training each algorithm is the equivalent of 5 cars usage for a lifetime within those cars. And so when I guess what I'm asking is sort of, can our ethics kind of account for some of these broader sort of planetary health impacts? And when we get down to Kadija's point about reciprocity, should we be thinking just in terms of reciprocity to the people who give data, but also to the ecosystems that give the resources that enable us to work with that data? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful panel discussion. My first question is to Z, that as you time and again mentioned in your presentation about the Chinese state supporting the entrepreneurial venture on AI, so how do you see the Chinese state as a capitalist entrepreneurial state supporting a network nature of algorithmic discrimination against its own citizens to sustain its own political agenda? And the second question is to Kadija, a very wonderful presentation. As you said that social relationship, human social relationship, in fact, produce that data. So once the data is produced, is given, how do you see that becoming as external thing, which itself is appropriated by all the players and in a way exerts pressure on the individual human relationship in a very Durkheimian way? Yeah.
Yeah.
So my question is for Z, and it's really an informational question. Sakiko in the previous panel mentioned that we have to think about the state differently, not just as a regulator, but as a purveyor of these new technologies. And in some ways, your talk was the perfect segue, because there's no better example than that of China and its massive investments and strategic plans for AI. That gives an example of a state which is very much a purveyor of these technologies and not just a user or regulator. And so I guess I was curious whether you could shed a bit of light on the internal processes through which priorities are set in developing particular AI technologies in China, because a lot of what we get here in the West are these, scandalous headlines about facial recognition being used for social surveillance and so on and so forth. But I'm curious as to how, within that system, how are priorities actually determined?
Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So, Channel Alto, I'm from the Caribbean. I actually teach public health. Just two quick questions, really. One to Kadija, with respect to the gift concept, how do you reconcile the commodification of health data and precision medicine now that you're actually looking towards, probably selling people's data and then insurance companies actually making use of that inappropriately in premium setting? And to Ms. Gibbons, I believe, I just want to get your guidance probably. There seems to be a disparity between the developed world and the developing world with respect to the ability to put a regulatory framework to be able to deal with all these IT technology, including AI. How do we assist developing countries that may not have the inherent capacity to regulate this kind of new developments? Yeah?
Okay, I think we'll stop at that point, and perhaps we can just take them in order. Elizabeth, would you like to comment first? And then.
Well, Ali, of course, has asked a challenging question that I don't have the answer to. I'm not sure I entirely understood why a triple AQ would lead to a bad result necessarily. I think it's really more a framework together with the general principles that I was trying to propose that would actually give an answer of whether it's a bad result or not a bad result. Regarding actually the threat to democracy, there is a subsection in the chapter on sustainable development dealing with that, and particularly with journalism, and has some standards for gatekeeping for that kind of thing. But of course, it's putting it all in practice is extremely challenging, and who's even going to resource it? Everyone might want it, but who's going to resource this? And there's a whole subsection about how you analyze where bots are coming from, who's paying them, who's using their data, et cetera, et cetera. So I refer you to the report, but thank you. Regarding the regulatory frameworks for low and middle income countries, there was actually just recently a report put out by the UN called Digital Cooperation for exactly that, to give guidance on regulations. But amongst the recommendations in the Sustainable Development chapter was building capacity in the countries themselves, because too many low and middle income countries basically have no AI development capacity, no AI safeguarding capacity, and so it was stop the brain drain, help develop local capacity. There was research exchanges that were proposed and so forth, so that you would actually have not everyone being hapless victims of a system that they don't understand, but there could be national capacity and also with UN support. So that report you may want to have a look at.
Kadija?
Yes. So I think I had about 3 questions, and I'll sort of take them one by one. So the first question about does this idea of, does the theory of the gift, does this idea of thinking about data as a gift account for, can we expand it out to think about kind of planetary impacts and reciprocity in that way as well? And I think that that's a great, idea, and that is a way to sort of expand this idea of reciprocity, right? To think about the multiple sort of holders of resources and providers of resources, and the multiple sort of relationships of providing and maybe in some cases, even if those resources are sort of being taken and not offered up as a gift, I think if we, right, and as much as, right, any theory has, you know, its limits, right, but as much as we can sort of think through this, use this as a framework to think through, right, because my goal with sort of bringing in, thinking about data in this way was sort of like how I posed it in the talk, right, like this is not the one ethical value, right? But what else can we think about? How can we think about things differently if we start to think through things sort of using this framework? And so I think it does provide a way to say this is why reciprocity is important, and where are our obligations? Where can we start to identify where there could be, as someone else mentioned, sort of bundles of rights, but also bundles of obligations, right? To whom do we owe something? Where are our responsibilities? Because as we all know, responsibilities is sort of a key part of thinking through ethics. So in that sense, I think it could be a useful way to, when thinking about larger sort of planetary issues, to think about what are our responsibilities, what are our obligations, and where are we actually getting resources from, so then that would then trigger this need to reciprocate. The second question was, or the other questions were sort of, how do we think about, I guess the other two questions were related in the sense of how do we think about when data as gifts become external and sort of used in multiple ways, so either act outside of maybe initial relationships or the initial relationship in which this gift giving was established, or when they sort of enter into the market and become commodified. And I guess what I will say to that is a few things, I guess, right? So we can think about gift relationships and the sort of ethics of the gift sort of operating in parallel to a market, right? So even when Mose was thinking about this idea of the gift, he proposed it as a way, a sort of theory of how human sociality began, right? But we could imagine that this gift giving was also happening alongside of sort of commodity relationships as well. And I think what I will say about sort of gift giving and market relationships is specifically in the case of biomedical research, right, which is not quite in the market context, although there are many connections. We are at a place when we think about some of the large-scale precision medicine projects like the NIH's All of Us research program, which was in the slides I didn't talk about, that's on track to be the largest research study ever to enroll 1 million people. It's really, in some ways, we are sort of in the early days of precision medicine and precision medicine research, where we are able to sort of decide what our ethical frameworks will be. What values are we going to optimize for when thinking about precision medicine research? And so I would say in that sense that at least in biomedical research, there's an opportunity to sort of think about what the possibilities are, not totally excluded from the market and market forces, right, but at least within sort of setting up the ethical frames of biomedical research. And can we put reciprocity in there and optimize reciprocity as a value that we want to highlight when thinking about biomedical research? And then the other thing that I would say is, right, that of course this is happening, this kind of ethical development is happening when, as you said, right, precision medicine, genetic health app data is already commodified, is being used in multiple ways, is being used by health insurance companies for risk allocation and things like that. But we've seen examples even in the market sector of 23andMe, for example, where, right, they are a big industry player, right? They don't make any, they don't make it a secret that this is what they're in. Well, I would say they sort of market themselves as a genetic testing company, but we all really know that they are a data collection company, right? The product of the genetic testing is really actually not what they're selling. What they're selling is the data that they get back and then sell it to other people. But in any case, with that example, there was a controversy a few years back where although people had sort of read the terms and conditions for signing up for 23andMe and getting their data and paying this company to take their data, that their users felt sort of left out of the loop when they heard that the company was using their data to develop a drug for Parkinson's, right? And I think that even in these market contexts, you can still see sort of glimmers of what we can see as this gift relationship, or people feeling like there is something owed to them, or there are some obligations that are not being met. And so I think that as this, if we can optimize for reciprocity, let's say in the biomedical research context, and if there is this sense of, obligation sort of already happening even in the market sector as well, I think as this idea of reciprocity expands in the biomedical sector, we might see kind of that pressure bleeding over into the market sector to say, okay, this is kind of this is a new kind of ethical demand, right? That even as we're operating in the market sector, that consumers expect something back. They expect we have obligations to our consumers in some way. Maybe a little bit too optimistic, but as the field is sort of developing, it's a possibility that's worth considering. So,
Thank you very much. G?
Okay, brilliant. So I'm going to divide my response in two parts. The first part, I'm going to start off from Peter's comments. And I mean, there was one particular pertinent issue we would need to think about here is that why technology optimism? Because apparently that there have been people who are quite pessimistic about the future of technology as well. But why those people are not really gaining an upper hand in all this development of technologies, and why it's technology optimism that has been, dominating us. Now, some of the answers, I think, it can be traced back to Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations, because when we have been reading The Wealth of Nations, and Adam Smith, in his formulation of the ideas, it's not simply about the invisible hand to be played by market. Actually, I mean, there was this famous moral dilemma of Adam Smith, is that when market has been allowed a free rein in its development, then at the end of the day, there will be some tipping point where market may come into conflict with public interests. So how this moral dilemma is going to be solved? So when we're reading like The Wealth of Nations, actually beyond the text we can see that Adam Smith has input an assumption there. And he was assuming that at the end of the day, as market proceeds, then there will be a unification of private interests with public interests. So this unification of private and public interests is going to ensure that these two track of development, one day they will converge and bring about benevolent and benefits to human society. But what we have seen in the past 200 years actually is quite reverse of this picture, and especially in our age when we have been thinking about this digital development, and actually we see, like, we can call it a corporate capture of those technology development, because apparently that when private companies, they have been developing technologies, all their primary concern is profit seeking. And this profit seeking sometimes is at the expense of those public concerns and interests. So this is why it's so important, as Liz's case actually has demonstrated, we need so many people from diverse backgrounds to participate. And even if when you just know not really that much about artificial intelligence, it will be absolutely essential that you have a voice in the formulation of such policies, and so, because that will serve as a guideline of the future, how technology will be used and made available to the different segments of the society. Now, the second question, and I can actually tackle the comments made by Susan, by Rajiv, and Manjari all together, because Susan, in her comments, she started with this, like, the democracy challenge of technology, and then Rajiv was talking about this, the Chinese state and its role in it, and Manjari was asking about this question of priority setting in China. It's actually altogether one issue, and there were actually two perspectives that will help us to elucidate of this whole process. The first one is this called ANT theoretical framework, which was formulated by Bruno Latour, and he was called actor network theory. And basically, this theory was trying to argue that science and technology, they do not have standalone value, but rather, I mean, they would need to be contextualized in social milieu, because they have a relational meaning interpretation which can only be made sense of in the social context in which they are embedded. So this is why we see, like, for instance, companies like Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, they could actually start with a quite pernicious circle of interference with democratic processes. And then also, like in China, we see how technology can be used to further the interest of the state. And so these issues, actually, they are all together. It's a, how, like, for instance, in the different context, the technology is actant, and how they are made sense of, like, by the different users. And the second perspective that can help us to understand this is actually a conversation I had with Liz last night. It's especially this debate among economists about whether, like, industrial policy should take a lead in the development of national economy, or whether we should just let the market to do that. So we see industrialists and then the market fundamentalists, these two different camps who are debating against each other. And when we think about, like, in China, and this goes to Manjari's question, especially, like, for a system like China, it's particularly powerful in amassing a whole team of technocrats who are very good at in collecting information about the latest development of artificial intelligence in other countries. So priority setting will be in this based on learning the best practices elsewhere. And sometimes we can call it a model, either it's a knockout model or copycat model. It's destructive innovation. Now, destructive innovation means first of all, you take something from your competitors, and then you deassemble it. You try to study all those, like, the teeny-weeny components of this, and then you try to reassemble them together. But this time, you are giving it something new. So this kind of destructive innovation China is particularly good at. So this is one of the things why, like, artificial intelligence could be developing so fast in China. It's because it's based on, like, learning from other countries, especially those best practices, and then you combine it together with the demands and the needs in China. So this is a thing, and I think that these, like, the different theoretical debates can help us to understand issues on that.
Peter, would you like to comment also on some of the other comments?
Comments on the
Comments
answers. A number of good questions and lovely points made in response. I just want to address a few of them in terms of rights as a kind of, the floor and not the ceiling. And I think that is very important as a separate notion than values and ethics and governance and law. But we already have them in place. Systems should just have hard constraints to respect them. What that means in practice, we can debate. When we get into values, we're very much talking about political questions. Whose values? Who's represented in discussions about the design of technology? Who's designing the technology for whom and who benefits? And what we've seen with technology since Adam Smith is it's deployed by the powerful to create more power. It's deployed by the rich to create more wealth. They exacerbate. It's not just reproducing inequality, they are amplifying and accelerating inequalities, right? And so they really have to be realigned to different sets of values. And in a sense, the opportunity is there to have a discussion around the implementation of all these systems to shift some of those values, to shift the design of these systems so that they do represent more community and global values rather than the values of the interested parties. But tomorrow I'll say, like, without the regulation, why is that going to happen? And this, I think, also comes to the externalized costs question. You're talking about cybernetic systems and feedback. If you don't have a signal kind of feeding back into the system, it's not going to optimize for that. And so whether that's, carbon getting pumped into the atmosphere or using tons of electricity to compute your neural network, if you're not sort of figuring that into your policy and planning, if there's not a kind of feedback signal there, you're not going to deal with it or manage it in any way. And I think this comes to these kind of bigger questions about the democratization of the technology and the de-democratization of the technology. And the ability of large and powerful individuals and organizations to deploy the technology in their interests much more readily and much more quickly than these more distributed models. And hopefully there are ways to counteract that, but I'll talk a bit tomorrow. It's also about who controls the data, and that becomes, I think, a central point of political contention.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a lot of things I'd like to follow up from that, which we can pick up in this afternoon and tomorrow's session. I think on a more sort of practical level, this debate about ethics, human rights, SDGs, which in terms of actually achieving change, sort of political change, which of these is more effective, I think. But also, I very much liked your hyper-optimization concept, and then it got me thinking about hyper-optimism. We're sort of in a situation of hyper-optimism. and I mean, of course, the danger with optimization, and I talk as a former economist, is that tends to narrow you down, as you say, to the efficiency being the ultimate value, which is an extraordinarily narrow version of reality. But okay, we are only 5 minutes over time, so I assume that I should now close, and you can tell us about lunch.